Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a renowned international lawyer and author. He has represented countries and businesses in nearly 1,000 international disputes around the world, including cases involving Sudan, Ethiopia, and Yemen. He taught at universities in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa, including Harvard Law School, National University of Singapore, and St. Gallen University. He lives in London with 2 Maine Coons and travels widely. The File is his first novel. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Gary Bourne.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was a very, very gracious introduction.
Gary, I can tell from your resume the answer to this question, but our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
So that's a good question. And as you say, my resume suggests the answer. This isn't actually my first book. The File is, it turns out, my first novel, my first spy thriller, but I've written a dozen or so law books about international arbitration, international law of one sort or the other. And I think the real question is, what took me so long to write my first thriller, my first work of fiction? And the answer is I was trying to make it really good. It took a lot of time to get it to be just in the place that I wanted it to be. And I do have to confess, my day job, practicing as a lawyer, traveling to far-flung destinations around the world, crowded out some of the time that I might have liked to have spent working on the thriller. But we got it there.
Well, The File publishes on March 28, 2023. It's on pre-order now for any of our listeners who tune in later. That's when it will hit the stands. So we're excited to hear, because World War II Nazi files and the wreck of a German bomber in the jungle with a billion-dollar war chest, that does sound like a nail-biting thriller. And we have to know, where did you get the inspiration for this story?
Well, thank you for that. That hits the nail on the head in terms of what the story begins with. It begins with a bombed, the wreckage of a Nazi bomber lost in the jungle for 70 years, discovered by the heroine of the story, an intrepid young woman who chances upon the wreckage and, perhaps to her distress, finds a file of documents that do 2 things. They reveal the identities of the Nazis' most highly placed American spies, and also the war chest that you mentioned, billions of dollars hidden in Swiss bank accounts. Unsurprisingly, immediately, 2 very evil men on opposite parts of the world, Moscow and Washington, discover that Sarah has found the file. And they begin to chase her through the jungles of Africa, chase her across the deserts of the Sahara, chase her up the boot of Italy to Switzerland, where the book has its climax. I got the idea for that story when I was hiking myself in the jungles of Central Africa, of Uganda and the Congo, and just began to wonder, well, how easy it would be for things to be lost here in the middle of nowhere where nobody hardly ever goes, and what might result if one chanced upon something lost there in the wilderness.
Well, that's very creative. I didn't have that kind of creativity. I always thought if I could just find this hope chest in someone's attic that would have a wonderful masterpiece in it. I didn't go as far as you did in the jungles with the bomber and the billions of dollars. I was just hoping for a nice painting.
Well, that, in a funny way, that's also a little bit like what Sarah was hoping for, the heroine in the story. She was out exploring in the jungle for flowers. She's a botanist, and instead of a masterpiece or a flower, she chanced upon the file, which resulted in her friends being killed in front of her very eyes before the chase began across Africa and Europe.
Well, once you wrote this book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to use a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
So I was fortunate. I'm sure what almost every first time author does, which was send out about 500 unsuccessful requests for inviting people to be my agent. I never got so many rejection letters, or in some cases, they didn't even bother to send me a rejection letter. But the takeaway was nobody wanted to be my agent. And then just by chance, a friend of mine who had a contact with my publisher, History of Books, suggested my manuscript to the editor there, and the editor fell in love with it. And thus, without an agent, I had a publisher. I didn't self-publish, and it's taken a while to work its way through the getting a cover design and the editorial process and so forth. But once I'd secured the publisher, things began to fall in place.
Well, are you writing every day, or do you have another book in you?
I definitely have some other books in me. My law books keep calling as well, and I feel a little bit like I'm betraying my fiction vocation, my calling to write spy thrillers. But I am working on other law books. But I definitely do have some other ideas about spy thrillers. Indeed, I have an outline for a second book of fiction. And the way I write, I suppose everybody writes in a different way. I don't actually write every day. I find bizarrely the best time to write, the way that I write best, at least in my view, is on long airplane journeys. So when I fly off to, I don't know, Singapore or Los Angeles or wherever, I just with a school child's notebook, write in longhand, and sort of edit as I go along, and sort of do a few chapters, a chapter perhaps only, or a couple chapters at a time, and then a bit like building a snowman or whatnot, it gradually accumulates. Obviously, that's the beginning of the process, and the painful editorial phases and restructuring phases come after that. But oddly enough, it's airplane rides that seem to get me most inspired.
Well, I think that's a great idea, because as much as you're flying around the world and have those transcontinental flights, that it's a perfect time. That's like being on a writing retreat, where you just have plenty of time to write and you're not interrupted.
That's actually exactly right. Sometimes you got to put earpods in or whatever so that you truly aren't interrupted. But as long as there's no Wi-Fi on the airplane, there's nobody that can disturb you, and it is just like a retreat.
What do you think is the most challenging part of your artistic process?
So I think clearly um, converting your plot, the plot that I up with into a manuscript is extraordinarily difficult. What I usually do when I write is come up with a sort of chapter by chapter plan or outline of what the ultimate book will look like. Typically, each chapter is built on a main character. You can have the main character in multiple chapters, but there's an outline of chapters and a pretty good idea of what happens in each chapter and where that chapter takes place. But then getting from, this chapter takes place in the jungle. It's about Sarah. She's being chased. Getting from that high level outline to an actual, 1,000 word, 2,000, 3,000 word draft of a chapter is just extraordinarily challenging. It's very rewarding, but you sit there with a blank piece of paper in front of you and say, well, what exactly does it look like when you're getting chased through the jungle? And there are a million choices you could make, and making those choices, committing to them, and then writing it up is really, really challenging.
Well, you're definitely a plotter. And going from international law to fiction, that's a huge leap.
Indeed, it is. When you do legal writing, in a way, it's very constrained. If you're arguing a case for your client, it really does have to be based on the evidence. You're given a bunch of documents, you're given some witness statements, and you have to write a narrative that's a bit like fiction writing, but unlike fiction writing, you're really tied to those things that happened. You're also tied by whatever the rules of procedure are that you need to follow in a particular court, in a particular tribunal, page limits or rules about footnotes or various things like that. And so you really do operate both within the law. You have to pay attention to what the law says, but also lots of other things are dictated. In writing fiction, it's the exact opposite. When I come back to that empty page where Sarah's getting chased in the jungle, that bit of the jungle can be anywhere. I can change it from jungle to desert to tundra. I can change the chapter from Sarah to one of the bad guys that is pursuing her. There are an infinite number of choices, and it's a very, very different enterprise. And when you think about it, the last thing you want, actually, when you read a spy thriller, when you read something that's meant to be gripping, is some boring lawyer's prose. It's a precise opposite.
Well, you're using both sides of your brain now.
Hopefully, or we'll have to see what the readers think. Some of them may think neither side, but I do try to use both.
Do you think writing your first book changed your process of writing for your second novel?
A lot more organized. I didn't have much idea the first time around about how to go about it. I'm well and truly self-taught here. I didn't go to any writing courses and didn't take any creative writing classes in university or at any other time ever. And so I just began. This time, the second time around, I've been a lot more organized in terms of coming up with who the characters are, what the plan of the chapters is, how detailed the outline of each chapter ought to be.
So you're not going to write a series using this heroine. You're going to write a different, a standalone novel.
It's a great question. The file does end with a very real possibility of a sequel. I don't want to, spoiler alert, I don't want to let on what exactly happens at the end, because I think it's sort of exciting, but there definitely could be room for a sequel. I doubt there's much room for a prequel, But there can definitely be a sequel. The one I'm working on, though, is a standalone novel. It's new characters. It's called The Priest. It involves China, and I think people who like sit on the edge of your chair thriller will be very intrigued by it as well.
I like your concise titles of your books.
I had to persuade my publisher to let me keep the file. They were worried about what that would look like if you did a Google search.
Did real people inspire any of your characters?
That's a very good question. They did. Some of the people, so the two main villains were definitely inspired by people I've known in both Washington and Moscow, as you may recall. The two villains are respectively the deputy director of the CIA on the American side and a former KGB agent on the other side. Folks I've come across professionally were they aren't replicas of these people, but there was a good deal of things drawn from the real world. Sarah, the heroine, and Jeb, who she ends up traveling with and ultimately falling in love with, did as well come from people that I've known, close friends, actually.
And that's the fun part of fiction. You can do whatever you want with characters that of people that you've admired or people that you didn't, because I think my next novel is going to kill off one of my ex-husbands.
Yeah. I also drew on, I'll have to keep that in mind. Let me think about that. I also drew on actual experiences when I wrote about the places, when the locations that various things happen. As I mentioned, I was inspired in a sense by an actual location of the Ruwenzori Mountains in Africa as the sort of starting place for the novel. One of the main early scenes takes place in Berlin, and I lived there for several years, a couple decades ago, and other places as well. Zurich is one of my favorite cities. Zurich in Switzerland is one of my favorite cities in the world, and although bad things happen there, I drew on my good experiences in Switzerland.
I definitely think travel and settings can inspire us, and things just click in our brains after we've seen places like that, because my second book was inspired by Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado here in the US. And when I saw those what looked like condos built on the side of the mountain from this ancient people, that inspired me to think about, where did they go if they left there? They could have come to Texas, and that's what I wrote about.
That's a beautiful park, and it sounds like a very evocative setting for a book.
Well, I know even the Big Five are having us do most of our own publicity these days. Is there anything pre-publication that you've been doing to promote the book?
So I've been doing a variety of things. I've done a number of blog posts on different platforms that are sort of directed at fiction writing or crime writing, spy thrillers. I'm doing a social media campaign, and I've been on a smaller scale, more personal scale. I've just been promoting it with everybody I meet, whether on an airplane or in a restaurant or wherever. And it does take, I mean, it is a never-ending task. People are so flooded with information these days that finding a way to convey something new and hopefully interesting to them is a challenge.
Well, as my Southern mother once said, you only have one time to make a first impression, but that's really not true in the publishing business. We have many years to promote these books. They make us think that it has to be done in the first 6 months, but people discover books from authors years after they've been written. So we do have many more times to get that message out there.
I hadn't thought about that. That's a very good point. And when you think about how various books were discovered, even in recent years, that's absolutely right. Things can lie as sleepers for a bit and then come to life.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the passage that you've brought to share today and then read from it so we can hear your tone and voice in the book?
I'll do that. So the passage is just the very beginning of the book. It's when the heroine of the novel, Sarah West, in a sense, when she's first introduced to the audience, to the readers, the passage, although it's at the beginning of the book, is actually taken out of chronological sequence. It's from sort of halfway through the book, after she has made her way alone, chased by a couple dozen Russian mercenaries through the darkest rainforests of Africa. She's ended up in a small African village, and the first line of the book, which I'll read in just a second, is also the first line of the last chapter of the book. Perhaps when I'm done reading the passage, I'll say a bit more about that without hopefully spoiling things for my readers. So with that, here goes. She looked across the lake as the sun began to set. Her eyes were gray, like the waves washing against the shore. She stood at the window of the hotel room. The window panes were dirty, cracked in a few places, and never repaired. Thick rusted bars were anchored into wooden beams at the top and bottom of the window frame. She looked between the bars, up and down the dusty road, for signs of the men who were hunting her. An old woman returning home from the market, wrapped in a length of faded cloth, balanced a basket on her head as she picked her way past the potholes, but otherwise the road was empty. She opened the window and reached through the bars to close the shutters. They were weathered with slats missing in a handful of places and creaked as she pulled them shut. She closed the window and drew the curtain, shutting out the evening light. She turned away from the window and walked across the room. The concrete floor was rough, and she could feel the grit beneath her feet. The room was empty, the white-washed walls and ceiling barely visible in the half-light. A single cot with threadbare sheets stood against the wall. Mosquito netting hung from the ceiling above the bed, mended in a dozen places and streaked where guests had killed the insects that came in from the lake. She'd found the hotel earlier that day. It was all she needed. It took cash, no questions asked, and had a room with a sink and a mirror. The sink was chipped and missing one of the faucets. The mirror was older with faded glass. A single bulb was mounted over the mirror and cast feeble yellow light into the darkness of the room. She turned on the one faucet that still worked and washed her hands, using what was left of the bar of coarse soap to scrub away the mud from weeks in the jungle. When she was finished, she dried her hands and opened the backpack that lay on the bed cot beside the sink. She took out the thick stack of papers that had almost cost her life and laid it aside. She searched inside the pack and found the candle and matches. She lit the candle and let the wax drip onto the bedside table before fixing the candle upright. Deeper in her pack, she found the medical kit, bright red with yellow Cyrillic lettering, and took out the iodine, bandages, and the package with the sterilized needle, then arranged them on the table. She looked into the mirror above the sink. The girl had thick blonde hair, tangled and dirty from the jungle, pulled back from high cheekbones, still lightly streaked with mud. Her eyes were almond-shaped, half blue, half gray, wide-set and large. Their gaze was cold and wary, as if they were watching something in the distance. She looked away from the mirror, barely recognizing the reflection. She wore jeans, torn in a half-dozen places and caked with mud, rubbed deep into the creases. Her T-shirt was once white, but now gray and brown, mottled with white where her sweat had dried. On her left side, the cloth was dark brown and stiff. She took a breath and then lifted the t-shirt up gently over her left breast. The gash was 20 centimeters long, starting at the end of her collarbone and running diagonally down to the place where the swell of her breast began. It had been made by a machete wielded by one of the men who was hunting her in the jungle. The man had barely missed her throat as she wheeled cat-like away from his blade, gleaming silver in the moonlight, pivoting so that he almost missed her entirely. But he hadn't, and instead the tip of his blade had caught her, tracing a glistening slash across her chest. She looked back into the mirror, eyes locked in the faded glass, and let her fear rise. She let it wash over her the way she had practiced, and then steadied herself, leaning against the sink. She put aside the fear and the sadness that had stalked her through the jungle for the last 3 weeks. She picked up the iodine and drenched the wound above her breast before swabbing it clean, trying to ignore the surge of pain that followed. There were no more painkillers. She'd taken the last of the tablets from the medical kit the day before. She opened the package that contained the needle, already threaded with a length of surgical thread. She held the tip against the candle's flame and wiped it clean. She leaned forward further, hips pressed tightly against the sink, and held the top of the wound closed, then drew another breath. She poised the needle against her skin on one side of the wound before pushing it in, forcing the metal through her skin, watching the droplets of blood well up out of the puncture. Then she drew the needle slowly through that side of the wound, followed by the surgical thread, before pushing the point of the needle into the other side of the gash and forcing it back into her flesh. She could feel the thread slide through her skin as she pulled it tight, the knot tugging against the wound. She stopped and leaned against the sink, bracing herself against the pain. Then she rested the tip of the needle against the side of the wound again, less than half a centimeter from the first stitch, and did it once more. And I think I'll stop there. It's been a long passage.
Very intriguing. You've got us right there wanting to know what happened to her.
You'll have to read it.
What a strong heroine you've created.
And she was obviously just a normal person. She was like me or you or any of our listeners when all of a sudden she was presented with completely abnormal, completely extraordinary circumstances. And the story is really about how she rises to that.
Did you have to complete research on World War II, on all of these bunkers or airplanes or places that she traveled? Did you do any research before you began writing or as you went along?
Yeah, so I did do research. I did it mostly as I went along. I drew on some things that I already knew. In the book, the Nazi deposits, the billions of dollars that the Nazis deposited at the end of World War II is in numbered Swiss bank accounts, and I'd actually done a number of cases involving numbered Swiss bank accounts, and so I drew on both that knowledge and then some subsequent research I did to sort of flesh that out. I had to do little bits of research on all sorts of things. You know, what kind of bombers did the Nazis have at the end of World War II? What airports were open in the last week of World War II? Where might a plane have flown from? Research on Libya. I don't want to spoil things too much, but the chase takes her through the jungles to this scene that I just read, and then by way of a UN aid mission and airported at a UN air base into the Sahara Desert, and I had to do research on all that. There were a number of separate steps that I did, and that was part of the fascinating aspect of writing the book, learning about those things, those places.
Well, it just sounds like a fascinating book, and I can't wait to read it, and we wish you much success on it. And Gary, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are quite unique. Do you have any advice for writers 50 and above?
I think my advice for writers, authors over 50, writers 50 and above would be the same as my advice for those under 50, maybe even under 15. And that's very simply just don't give up. It can be an extraordinarily long process, both the process of writing, when you can sort of get frustrated, get writer's block, not be happy with things you've written. Also, the process of getting published. I described the 500 or so rejection letters that I received, and I think that's not unusual at all. I think everybody has a huge challenge in getting attention. But just plain don't give up.
It's great advice for all of us today. And you've led such a fascinating and are leading such a fascinating life. And you've certainly created a fascinating work for all of us. So we appreciate your being with us today, and happy to say that you're now counted in our authors over 50.
Thank you, ma'am. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.